Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen cinemas being told to shut down as part of a more general lockdown in France, Ireland, Austria, Germany, the UK, Italy, Belgium, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia, local closure in Russia and Romania, and we've also had the Asturias and Catalonia in Spain. Some of these cinemas will have to shut down later this week at time of recording. Some were just announced over the last weekend, but that's so far the list of countries we've had.
This is the Box Office Podcast. I'm Daniel Luria, the editorial director of Box Office Pro, the only publication exclusively dedicated to theatrical exhibition here in the United States, covering every country in the world, in fact. And I am joined here today by our co-host, Rebecca Pauley, deputy editor at Box Office Pro. Rebecca, welcome. It's been another week of very interesting news.
Interesting and copious. A lot of stuff to cover today, including our feature interview here with Laura Houlgatte Abbott of European trade body UNIC to kind of break down what's going on in Europe right now, which is something we spoke about in last week's episode. And now we have stuff going on in Europe and stuff going on in the US too. The fun never stops.
A lot of breaking news really coming in over the last 7 to 10 days and more really scheduled over the next week, especially as we record this today on Election Day here in the United States. We expect to have a lot more headlines to influence the path of this reopening cycle globally for COVID-19. But before we jump in, a quick reminder to our listeners. We are looking for your feedback on the podcast so far. If you could take the time to answer the survey that is in the description section of this podcast on Spotify and Apple. Just click on it, let us know your thoughts. And hey, if you enjoy what you're listening to, please rate us on iTunes, on Spotify. Drop a review. It allows us to do this every week. So without much further ado, Rebecca, let's jump right into it before we bring in Laura Houlgatte Abbott, the CEO of UNIC, the trade association covering European exhibitors, because there's really a lot to cover. We're getting a lot of those Q3 financial reports coming in from publicly traded companies. You started with AMC this week. What were some of your insights from that earnings call?
Yeah, Daniel, quarterly earnings call season, always an interesting time. So one of the subjects that Aaron touched on is that AMC does have enough cash to get through the beginning of 2021. And he did clarify that beginning of 2021 thing, that is a worst case scenario. That assumes that AMC won't be able to raise any more capital, which of course they are looking for and raising more capital. And it assumes that attendance numbers stay as they are now. Of course, we're all hoping that that's not the case. We're all hoping that attendance numbers raise because we're all hoping that the November-December release calendar, particularly a film like Wonder Woman, we're all hoping that sticks and that attendance goes up as a result of that. So that's something that AMC and every cinema operator in the United States is really hoping for in order to give a bump to the financial viability of the sector. Something else that was touched on in that call, Adam Aaron kind of got ahead a bit of the question of, hey, so Cineworld and Regal closed the vast majority of their locations in the UK and the US. Are you going to be doing that? Do you have any plans to do that? And the answer that he gave was basically no. Many AMC theaters across the United States have gone to a weekend-only schedule and have between 1 and 2 showtimes per day as opposed to the usual 4. So basically they're kind of slowing down the, hours per day that they're in operation, which per Aaron is the decision that makes more sense for AMC compared to a full-on closure. So that's what we heard from AMC. There was also some discussion of that much talked about AMC Universal deal that can see Universal and Focus Features titles go to PVOD as little as 17 days after their theatrical release. Adam Aaron and AMC do seem still very, very bullish on that. A quote that jumped out to me is, he said, AMC is not stuck back in 1955, and we are willing to consider alternate models when it comes to streaming and the windows. Of course, that's an evolving conversation, but with Universal and Focus titles, one of them, Kajillionaire, already came out. It actually already came out, and then 17 days later went to PVOD.
So we've already seen
it.
That shift already happen. It's
Yeah.
not very well reported, obviously, because a title like Kajillionaire from director Miranda July is more of an art house title that wouldn't capture those press headlines than maybe The Croods will in the future.
Yeah. Adam Aron, I mean, he actually did cite internal analysis, not sharing the data and the numbers, but that AMC made more with Kajillionaire going theatrical and then streaming 17 days later than it would have if they just stuck to the traditional 3-month window.
Really?
So,
that's very fascinating. And especially interesting because when we talk about that Universal deal, we have to compare it to what Disney has done, which is zero theatrical. They've already put those two big titles, one from Pixar and a live action remake.
Even drive-ins can't screen Mulan, like even theaters that were open.
So what we originally thought was quite an aggressive action from Universal is now looking to be really the probably most amenable partner for movie theaters in this reopening phase. And the long-standing sort of ally is really the one that has really jumped ship in going straight to streaming over the last couple of months. Really interesting to see how this develops.
Yeah, I mean, that's to paraphrase Adam Aron. He didn't say it this way, but basically the implication is us having this deal with AMC Universal is the only reason we're getting films in November, because Universal is putting films in theaters and none of the other major studios are taking that risk because they don't have that PVOD agreement in place. So, and just this morning, as we're recording this, Marcus also has had their own reporting going on.
Yeah, it's something that we're just getting into our inbox as we record this. But Marcus Theatres, the number 5 circuit in North America and number 4 in the United States, just reported their Q3 figures. They're in a slightly different position than a lot of other publicly traded circuits in that Marcus Theatres is slightly better positioned than its competitors from a real estate standpoint. It's a company that has over 1,000 screens, mostly in the Midwest, but they do have a nationwide presence. Now, Rebecca, 80% of those locations of Marcus Theatres reopened in August, anticipating that great promise of studio support we never really saw materialized beyond Tenet. And really, they were affected negatively by that subsequent lack of product after Tenet really didn't perform along expectations. So with 80% of the circuit reopened in August, Marcus Theatres went back and temporarily shut down 17 of those locations in October. Now, they have since reopened 4 of the 17. So as of today, they have 66%, 2/3 of its circuit currently open in the United States. They don't have plans to completely shut down that remaining third of the circuit. They do have plans to bring it back online once studios start committing to release dates. Of course, we really don't know when that's going to be because the December slate, as Sean pointed out in last week's episode, looks as tenuous as ever, and mostly because of overseas developments. Before we go into the overseas conversation, let's ease into it, Rebecca, by looking at some of the IMAX results that you were able to listen in on in their Q3 earnings call.
So IMAX, strangely, in 2020, was some positive news. It's good to hear. It's good to hear some of that stuff this year. But yes, they note obviously that the cinema landscape in the U.S. has been slow to bounce back. Unfortunately, they have had to furlough some people outside of their operations in China. That's not the good news, obviously. So China's weekly box office grosses are actually approaching, they're at about 70% of what they were in the second half of 2019. Compared to the entirety of 2019, IMAX's market share is pretty much the same as what it was. And when you break it down to a more granular kind of quarterly viewpoint, they're actually gaining market share, which is really interesting because in a normal year, about 70% of the money that IMAX makes in China comes from Hollywood titles, which right now we don't have. So that's something that we're going to hear, a little bit later in our conversation with Laura Houlgatte, the earnings power that local titles are having in some markets in the absence of these major Hollywood tentpoles that keep being delayed by the studios.
And it's something that you brought up, Rebecca, in a conversation we had with the executive team at Cairo Cinemas over in Europe about the importance of these premium formats in welcoming audiences back, right? And how the appeal of premium formats like an IMAX, and I'm very curious to see what we hear from formats like Dolby Cinema here in the United States through AMC, because audiences have been watching everything at home, and you've been watching everything on your TV with that sound system. That return to cinemas, you want as premium a big screen as possible, and it really is something that we're seeing reflected by the box office data and by these IMAX Q3 results, even without the content.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that IMAX CEO Rich Gelfond really narrowed in on as well, the fact that the people who go to IMAX movies, they're the super fans of movies. I mean, they're the ones who want that premium experience and who are willing to pay the extra charges to get that. So what he really brought up in this earnings call and what he sees is that the demand is there, particularly for these formats like IMAX, which is the really beautiful, wonderful theatrical experience.
It brings up, I think, a big question that a lot of marketers here in the US are asking themselves as they appeal to audiences in this recovery phase and in getting audiences back when there's no studio product, in making sure that the movie-going experience from a consumer perspective is quote unquote worth it, right? Let's compare it to something that we're not as close to, like indoor dining. Something that I haven't quite done yet here, because obviously here in New York, the restrictions in New York City are a little bit more advanced than I think in most other places in the world in what we're allowed to do. But for that first time back in the restaurant, I'm probably not going to go to McDonald's. I'm probably not going to do the Applebee's. I want to quote unquote, I want to make it special. I want to make it worth it. And I think that's the interesting reflection with these IMAX earnings reports. No matter what that title is, we're seeing that with cinema audiences around the world. They want to go back to that, like, wow, it's my first time back.
Yeah, there were the October national holidays in China, and IMAX, and in particular, this one local release did really well then because it was an event internationally and domestically, actually. Daniel, you listened into the Kinepolis call. What were the insights that you learned there?
It's interesting in that US recovery in audiences has just been statistically much lower than we've seen across Europe. Now, Kinepolis is a multinational circuit with a number of locations across several different European markets. They also have a presence in Canada. They own Canada's second largest circuit, Landmark Cinemas. And they also have a small presence in the United States with Michigan-based MJR Digital Cinemas. So they're very diversified in the markets that they are open. From that Kinepolis earnings call, the one data point that really stuck out to me is that in their worldwide circuits, admissions are down around 76% year over year. That figure, if I'm not mistaken, Rebecca, is closer to around 90% for a circuit like AMC on the US alone, right? Obviously, AMC is also a global circuit, but that figure of 90% more or less is more of a domestic snapshot. Globally, on the Kinepolis side, it's only three quarters, I say between quotes. That's still way too much. But you see that difference in engagement with audiences. And that brings us to our interview segment here on the podcast, where we had seen a much better recovery across Europe, with some individual markets doing fantastically well with national titles, as you mentioned, Rebecca. But then all of a sudden, really, it was 10 days ago, when we start hearing about key European markets going dark once again. And to speak about that with us today is UNIC CEO Laura Houlgatte Abbott. Thank you so much again for joining us, Laura. Let's start with, if you can just recap which markets have already announced closings across UNIC territories.
That's going to be the fun part of the podcast, yes. So I've put together a list, keeping in mind that in some countries it's very local closures that we're looking at. But over the past couple of weeks, we've seen cinemas being told to shut down as part of a more general lockdown in France, Ireland, Austria, Germany, the UK, Italy, Belgium, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia, local closure in Russia and Romania, and we've also had the Asturias and Catalonia in Spain. And I don't think I'm forgetting anyone here. Some of these cinemas will have to shut down later this week at time of recording. Some were just announced over the last weekend, but that's so far the list of countries we've had.
That is quite a long and depressing list.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is.
I mean, and what is we're seeing, in other markets, kind of, I guess, the step below closures with curfews, with F&B restrictions. Are those still in place in some markets, or have things kind of escalated to full closures at this point?
So interestingly enough, a number of countries which had, implemented a curfew are the one who moved ahead with closing down cinemas a couple of weeks later. So, mentioning, for example, France or Belgium. It's also interesting to mention, that's really something I would like to focus on, is that it's not cinemas that are specifically targeted as being a place which isn't safe. They are being closed as a much wider part of a more general lockdown or partial lockdown happening in all these territories. So basically to limit the kind of opportunities for people to just mix, and basically apart from going to work and doing your essential shopping, that's where most of the activities stop. But cinemas are not being specifically pinpointed as a place that it would not be safe to go to.
Now, what are we seeing that's different about this second closure cycle in Europe that was different from the first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different from the first in a couple, of ways. I think the first one, of course, is we've seen that the lockdown are being, a bit different to what they used to be. So, just to mention examples, schools remain, open in all these territories. We don't see a limit as such number of them in kind of how far people can go, away from their home. But I think, what we've seen for us when it comes to cinema is, again, they are just being shut down as a part of, limiting the, places to which the population can go to and interact, basically, just to try to control the spikes of virus that we're seeing across our territories. I think it happened really fast. It's fair to say that, we were not foreseeing this happening so quickly in terms of having second lockdowns. I think where we've been quite successful is in a number of countries, governments did say that cinemas were safe places. So they did acknowledge all the efforts that were put in place by cinema operators. They acknowledged that not a single case had been traced to a cinema, and that basically was safe for the audience to go there. But that, unfortunately, again, it was part of a more general logic of going back to an idea of a lockdown.
In these closures, which you note are across the board and don't target cinemas, so cinemas, restaurants, sports events, all that, we're seeing in some places like Wales, I think it was a 2-week quote unquote fire break. And in other areas, we're seeing kind of like a 2-week pause. I mean, is that most of these shutdowns, are they open-ended, or is there a plan to come back and look at it after 2 weeks? I know it's impossible to ask you to look into the future and say when they're going to be lifted, but does it feel to you? I mean, I know the first time around the shutdown, it kind of felt like it was going to go on until it was going to stop, and nobody really knew when that was going to be.
I think this time there is an understanding at government level that they need to give a deadline for reviewing at least the measures, that they can't just say this is open-ended and we don't know when we're going to start, reopening. We're going to take 2 weeks to review, or we are telling you that the lockdown is going to last for a month. So, for example, Belgium has announced, last week a partial lockdown that's going to last until 13 December. The UK has announced it for a month, starting from, 5th November, France for a month as well until 2nd December. And there is also understanding that, they are going to look at the impact on the figures, and that after 2 weeks or a month, there's going to be a review. And they're going to decide whether or not, this is going to be extended, whether or not some restrictions are going to be lifted. As you say, it's also, we're going to have to follow, of course, what's happening with these reviews.
How does this affect? I mean, some local markets have managed to come back pretty strong, I think, particularly in terms of local releases. What's been the impact among maybe these local studios in these countries that have been ordered to shut down? Are any of them like, wait, I was going to put a film out this weekend?
I think it's tough for everyone. I think it's tough, to be honest, for all the people in the industry that had decided to, show, their faith, of course, in the cinema experience. So, all the distributors at local level that had decided to release their films, but also all the tremendous work that has been, done again by cinemas, to train their staff to make sure they were going to welcome people in good condition. Even, taking into account all the new restrictions, you couldn't welcome suddenly a full auditorium, you had a cap on the capacity, you had, to respect social distancing, new health and safety measures. When you look at, the reactions at local level, I think there is an understanding that as part of a more general lockdown, yes, cinemas are being shut down, but there's also a sense of, disappointment, because when you've worked so hard to, ensure that the experience is both safe and enjoyable. And also we've seen, especially in September, titles being very successful, people coming back in numbers that really give you, a sense of strong optimism, dare I say. It is a bit of a blow. I mean, I don't think anyone can dispute that.
In terms of lessons from the first round of closures that you're applying to this second round, what do you think the European sector has learned from that initial stage that, as you note, was a bit more open-ended, a little scarier because we didn't really know how long it would last? What are we applying from that era as we encounter this second round?
I mean, I would not dare speaking on behalf of all my members on what they have learned, because I think they've all shown, how hard they worked during the first period of, close down. Both, national associations in keeping in touch with all their members, ensuring that people are receiving support when and if possible. Also all the work that's been done by cinema operators to keep in touch with their audiences, to keep in touch with their staff, to also, prepare for the reopening. And I think that's, the same logic is going to apply for this second wave, but I can't, I'm not sure I can tell you exactly what are the best lessons they've learned. I think what we've seen for sure, and I can really admire that, is just the enormous passion and work that goes into that business, which we all knew before this happened, but it was really displayed for me during this challenging period we find ourselves in. And us at UNIC, for example, I know what the lesson we've learned is, sharing, information of everything that's happening in other countries, all types of financial support that are being implemented and that can inspire some other governments, sharing experiences around audience initiatives. How do you keep in touch with your audience? I think the protocols for health and safety are here already, and they've shown they were, successful and that they worked really well. So, this is something that we will still continue to build on. And of course, ensuring that we remain in touch with our partners in the industry as well. So, trying for me to, keep that kind of relationships going. So relationship with your national government and authorities, relationship with your audience, relationship with your partners. I think that's key for sure.
Before this second wave of shutdowns, to rewind it a bit, what are the markets in UNIC's? I believe it's 35?
38.
38. I almost had it. I was close.
Almost
30,
there.
38 countries that are represented in UNIC. Are there some that were able to bounce back over the fall, maybe more than was expected, more than their neighbors? Are there any kind of those that you'd like to highlight from looking back before the second wave of shutdown to a happier time?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen, really, some territories that are more successful than others, especially where you had availability of new titles, both US and European. I think the Netherlands is the one I'm always quoting, because from week one, the audience was back. in the screening room in numbers, and they achieved quite amazing results given that their capacity for a long time was limited to 30 people.
30?
Maximum 30, so 30, only
wow.
30. I know. And then that increased a bit, and then that decreased again to 30. And, from one week to another in September, they even managed to have a positive box office figures compared to last year, which was
that's
baffling.
Great news.
Yeah, which was really baffling, and that for me was really a great example. France did really well. I mean, they're very lucky in the sense they had a diversity of titles to show to their audiences. So they really managed to, attract a lot of people. It's sad to say that, the most successful weekend since reopening in France was the one just before the second lockdown, for example. So, it really added insult to injury, if I can say that. Yeah. We also had, Denmark that had really successful titles being released. And I think the title, if I'm not mistaken, the title Druk, my Danish is not where it used to be, but which was released on at the end of September, was the best, debut performance for a Danish drama for the past 7 years, for example. So we've had really, a lot of success stories. And actually, if anyone is interested in finding all these success stories, they can drop us a line, because we've been compiling them in a document, territory by territory, really highlighting the successful titles, comparing them to, other titles in the previous years. And I think, again, it really highlighted that the audience was ready to come back, and it was coming back. And it's really something that we are, really emphasizing when we talk, with all our, partners, but also stakeholders. And of course, in my job here, lobbying the European institutions to, ensure that cinemas, are not forgotten and can, benefit from support, is that this is an industry that in Europe made 8.8 billion euros last year, and you just can't underestimate that.
And thanks again for joining us, Laura. There's been just so many questions that we've had in understanding this very sudden second round of shutdowns. Here in the United States, the fear is that a second round of shutdowns might put some cinemas out of business. And I say that with some major markets like New York City, like Los Angeles, still closed and still with no visibility whatsoever on when to open. I guess I have a two-part question. I'll start with my first part. How precarious is this second shutdown financially for European cinemas? Is it something that could potentially put folks out of business, or is that state aid really making a difference at this time?
So I think the first question is also linked to the second. Yes, state aid really makes a difference where it exists. And this is why we are pushing at all levels, local, national, European, to ensure that cinemas can benefit from support. Because we know that, without, any kind of financial support, it will be extremely challenging for, some of our guys to survive that period. And we were lucky enough to, see that period of reopening and being able to actually showcase that, again, the audience was coming back to the cinema, and that investing in cinemas right now was investing in a business that was, that had been very successful. And it's a whole combination of state aid. And again, I would refer people to our website, where we compile absolutely all the sources and all information about all our territories about financial support. But it is in my opinion, indispensable bridge to ensure that we can see the other side of 2020. And it can take very different forms. Again, it's, as I always say, unfortunately, there's not an ideal country that combines all the help that, that you could, wish for if you are a cinema operator. But, we're looking at support for rent. We're looking at support for your staff and employees. So anything like, furlough schemes. We're looking at, support, to losses incurred, by cinemas, like for tickets that are not sold. We're looking at, again, a whole variety, of different schemes. And I do think for me that, again, in my opinion, these are really crucial. And this is why, perfect timing again for recording. This is what we've issued this morning, a statement, a press release, that went out, widely to the press, but, first and foremost to national governments and European institutions, calling for financial support for cinemas, because we know we're going to need it. And we need it now. We can't wait 6 months. We can't afford to wait for 6 months or a year before this financial support is actually, being given. And that's the issue we've had in some countries, for example, where yes, support has been promised, but the money has not been seen yet. And then you have, good students where, support has been strong and support has been effective, and where it's also supported of kind of cinemas. And I'm going to finish with this. It's also a message that we are, carrying out there, is that all cinemas need support. It's really to ensure that we can maintain the diversity of cinemas we're lucky to have here in Europe. We need to make sure they can all benefit from some kind of support.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining and taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
This is the Box Office Podcast. This episode has been written by myself, Rebecca Polly, and Daniel Aria, and produced by Record Edit Podcast. Please take a second to look in the description of this podcast episode and give us your feedback on what you'd like to hear more of, what you'd like to hear less of. We'd all like to hear more of big tentpole movies coming out, but we'll do our best. Thank you so much.
And leave us a review.
Give us a review. Rate us if you like us. Don't rate us if you don't like us.
Yeah, important. Our bosses read it, so come on.
Please.
Be nice to us.
Thanks so much to Laura Houlgatte Abbott of UNIC for appearing on this episode, and thank you so much for listening. Please remember to subscribe and tune back in next week for more news on what's going on in the global exhibition industry.